So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to this webinar on smart cities and sustainability. This webinar is part of a series that the British Institute of International and Comparative Law co-organizes with the Center for AI and Data Governance of Singapore Management University. And I would in particular like to welcome my colleague, Professor Mark Findlay, who is the co-organizer on the side of the Singapore Management University. The idea of the series is to look at how a global crisis can change the law, but also how law and legal services can actually assist in the orderly management of global change. And one of the topics we're really interested in is smart cities, the use of AI, tech, and mass data sharing, and the impact that has actually on established neighborhoods and traditional ways of living in a city. And we wonder if that has a negative impact or a positive impact. So can we redirect basically AI and big data to improve social infrastructure? We will have a discussion about those questions. And we have a very distinguished panel today. Our first speaker will be Professor Iria Giuffrida. She is professor at the William Mary Law School, and she has been working on different issues arising from the use of artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies for many years now. She has a particular interest in smart cities, which she researches through the lens of governance and accountability, as well as cybersecurity. And her topic today is issues of governance and in particular accountability raised by smart cities. And our second speaker will be Dr. Tiago de Melo Cartacho from the University of Exeter, but he was also an invited professor in environmental law and administrative law at Nova School of Law in Lisbon, and he worked in Lisbon as an attorney as well. He advised local and national governments in the field of environmental law and planning. And his topic is uncertainty in cities, the role of adaptive law. Then our next speaker will be Professor Beatrice Potero Afila from Sciences Po Law School. She also is a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard, holds an LLM and SJD from Harvard Law School and an LLB from the Universidad de los Andes in Colombia. She co-founded, when she was in Harvard, a think and do tank called the Edgelands Institute, and that think tank studies the digitization of security in different cities. Her topic is the political economy of smart city technologies, with a focus on the institutional incentives that lead cities to adopt tech in different ways. Then our next speaker is from the University of Helsinki, Professor Päivi Kopisaari. She is a professor of communication law in Helsinki, and her main fields of research are media and communication law, personal data protection, tort law, constitutional law, human rights law, and criminal law. She has been leading several projects relating to personal data protection, and right now she's leading a project relating to legal challenges of 5G network and smart city infrastructure. And her topic will be personal data protection and the use of data-driven services when providing smart city services. And finally, our last speaker is Professor Gregory Calfesh from Toulouse University. He is professor of public law, specializing in public procurement law and urban planning law and European administrative law. And his research focuses on smart cities and the relationship between urban planning and economics. And his topic is the approach of smart cities through public services, with a particular focus on France. So thank you very much to all of you. And without further ado, I hand over to Professor Findlay, who will moderate the panel today. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks, Eva. I won't hold back the order. We'll go as Eva has just listed. Our first presenter tonight is Iria. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Again, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the globe right now. I'm just sharing my slides. which I hope are visible. My name, as mentioned, is Iria Giuffrida, and I teach at William & Mary Law School and at the Business School, but that's the bit that I have to do, not necessarily the bit that I enjoy. So just after minutes, and I, like all speakers, I think I could take about 10 hours to go through what I want to say. So I'm just going to touch upon really the high-level points of the kind of research that I'm interested in and the discourse that I would like to engage in with you today. I think that there are as many definitions of smart cities as probably there are speakers around this virtual table and listeners. So what I have been thinking about in my research, rather than trying to define what smart cities are, is trying to think about what are, based on the literature, which is really interdisciplinary at this stage, what are the key factors that are present when commentators, academics, etc., think about smart cities? And so I group them in what I call pillars. You can tell from my accent, I'm a European, and in fact, I've got a PhD in European law, so we do like pillars as a lot of architecture in the legal jargon. And I group in pillars, as I said, sort of those three core elements that I think are present in the discourse about smart cities. On one side, I put sort of the Internet of Things, and by that, I don't just mean the devices that obviously form part of sort of the connective tissues of smart cities, but also the physical and cyber infrastructure that rests behind them. Pardon me. The second pillar is perhaps the one that has a little bit more of a normative component to it, which is this idea that the technology, and I use it in a very loose term, and I'm sure that many of the other commentators will delve into more details. So the technology that is used in the smart cities has a sort of aspirational objective, which is that to optimize is to optimize the city, whether it is, I think there's going to be an analysis from an environmental perspective, from an administrative perspective. We're being presented with the smart cities, I consider it a little bit as the Greek polis, right? The Greek polis is an architectural space, but it is also a democratic aspiration. It's the space, is the agora, right? Around which then the democracy, a democratic component is physically as well as normatively articulated. And this is all well and good, and I think many of us do benefit from the efficiencies of smart cities. I live in a very, very small town called Williamsburg, Virginia, which has some smart traffic lights. The traffic in Williamsburg is probably 3 cars deep, so I really cannot complain. But I did live in London for about 17 years, and being able to manage traffic in a metropolis like London, being able to manage the commuters if and when they return to work in the office, it's certainly an element of advantage. But I think, spoiler alert, there are a lot of good things, and I think many of us around this virtual table are concerned about what the costs are for this optimization, sort of these great benefits that smart cities produce. And then the third pillar, if you wish, is the humans. A lot of us who write in sort of the space of law and technology do quite like to use a little bit of sort of the language of humans. And I mean humans in different ways. I mean, certainly the people, so us, the users of smart cities, the visitors of smart cities. I was recently in Madrid a few weeks ago, were actually caught. It's not COVID, but it feels like it. And I have seen an increase in CCTV cameras across the city, which for me was relatively staggering. I was used to it in London, and it was quite surprising to see quite as many in Madrid. And so me as a visitor of Madrid, I generated a lot of data points, including several visits to the pharmacy to get COVID tests. The second group of humans is the government, and that's the bit that I'm more interested in, which is the relationship between us as the demos and those whom we elect to manage and to govern us. But there's a third human character, right? And that's the industry. As I'm sure we all agree, when thinking about smart cities, it's very rare, if at all, that a local community, to being a local government or a local authority, is able to create either a smart city from the bottom up or retrofit the technologies to smart cities because the costs, right? The infrastructure is very expensive, maintaining infrastructure is expensive, mining and manipulating the data that we produce is also expensive. So industry is a critical partner in the development of smart cities. And of course, industry has objectives and ambitions and mandates that are obviously very different from those of government. And that's where sort of a lot of the literature focuses on what are the core risks from an administrative perspective in the development of smart cities. And I list a few. I don't want to go through all of them, other than perhaps refer to the last one. It's sort of the way I list them is sort of a reverse pyramid. All of the loss of privacy, privatization of citizen data, corporatization or privatization of public services, and datafication of citizens are sort of the ingredients that then produce this algorithmic governability or surveillance capitalism that is discussed in the literature. So by algorithmic governmentability, I wish I could pronounce it, we're really referring to decision-making power that is founded on this automated collection, aggregation, manipulation, analysis of data points, as I said, that we produce. With that objective, right, optimization, whatever that may mean, which has an effect of influencing, nudging us, right, to behave in a particular way. The sort of the question where I'm interested in and I try to explore in my work is, what does that mean from a governance perspective? Pre-smart cities, we had governance issues, and I think for the European lawyers at this table, you know, if we think back to the white paper on governance that the Commission published in sort of the early 2000s, the concept, the challenges to governance that multi-level decision-making powers were posing were already acknowledged then, but they're certainly becoming even more strained, if you wish, in this context. So the increasing automation of decision-making powers poses serious challenges, I think, to the democratic requirements of legitimacy, democracy, effectiveness, and accountability. So power is gradually moving upwards, is moving sideways to some of those participants that actually industry participants that owe absolutely no duty to account to us. And so for the last couple of minutes, I really want to talk about what I mean when I think about the accountability gap. And before I sort of delve into that, I'm going to take you on a very, very brief journey of what I mean by accountability. I think there are as many definitions of accountability as there are of smart cities. So I'm not going to do a sort of semantic exercise here. I just think about what do we generally want accountability to do. And there are three main objective purposes. I don't want to say that these are the only ones. There's an explanatory objective, so producing records for the purposes of explaining what has been done. There's a justificatory component and purpose, giving reasons, and there's an amendatory element, which is sort of submitting oneself to judgment and consequences, something I think Boris Johnson seems not to be terribly aware about. So accountability has got, for accountability to achieve these purposes, I argue that accountability needs to be seen as a process. There is a lot of discourse, perhaps more in the political arena, about accountability, meaning heads need to roll. I think that accountability means that, but also mean an opportunity for change. And I want to sort of stop here. It's this opportunity for change that I think smart cities create a certain barrier to, because the way in which decisions are made becomes more opaque. There's less accountability to us. And a lot of the decisions are made in the absence of explanation, which poses, from a global perspective, issues. I want to stop here because I'm conscious that I have the speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. Without further ado, I'll pass on now to Tiago.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you very much, Eva, for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I am very happy to bring you a presentation from from an environmental or a climate perspective, which is uncertainty in cities. I'll try to share some ideas on how law can be more adaptive, and with that, try to address problems with uncertainty in cities. This image is from Mali in the Maldives, and as you know, I believe that most of you know, Mali has an elevation of 2.4 meters, which means that in the future is it's very likely to be underwater, and this is one of the reasons why I believe smarter cities. If we want smarter cities, we really need smarter law and regulation. From my perspective, I will use smarter as adaptive from an environmental or a climate perspective. Obviously, that we could understand smarter in other from other perspectives. Here, I try to link 4 dots. One of them is cities. We could define them in different ways. I will understand them as human settlements. Well, people decide to live. Climate change. I give you an example of the effects of it, but there are lots of them, and they have been discussed in the last years widely. Smartness, and here smartness, Idia has already shared the importance of this and how it is applied. So we could understand this as the use of ICTs exactly to improve the economy, to improve to protect the ecosystems, improve the environment, and also bring to people more quality of life in the governance of the city. And then legal adaptation, which I believe, which I will argue for today, and I believe that it is really important in the future, and specifically in cities, as cities are the places where most of people decide to live today. These are some of the problems we can find in cities. There are complex systems of systems, social systems, ecological systems, technological systems. They are usually unstable because they are exactly systems of systems, and there are connections between them, and there are effects that are caused by what happens in the other systems. Obviously, that uncertainty caused by climate change has increased these instabilities. And the fourth one would be inequalities. I don't know one city where there are no inequalities. So this is one problem that needs to be addressed, and climate change also increases these realities. This means that cities need to adapt, otherwise we will fail. So we can use law. Well, we are discussing this today, but in fact, law can be both a tool for improving and enhancing resilience and justice and good things, but also an obstacle if it is too crystallizing and if it's not able to accompany or follow what is happening in the territory and within communities. So the suggestion would be adaptive law. Here I try to follow some ideas from Tony Arnold and Lance Gunderson, who suggest as a set of conceptual tools and institutional characteristics to facilitate this adaptation in these different systems as a new paradigm or legal paradigm to exactly replace the ill-equipped to adapt legal systems that are rigid, that ignore interrelationships among different systems, and they have prescriptive rules, and they're not prepared to unexpected change. This means that we can find in maladaptive legal systems some of these characteristics with systemic goals that are narrow, monocentric structures, unimodal structures, fragmented at the same time, than inflexible methods that employ rules, legal abstractions, they resist to change, they intend to be too rational, too linear, legal centralist, and assuming away uncertainty. On the other hand, more adaptive legal systems would have a multiplicity of articulated goals. It could be polycentric, multimodal. It would have an integrationist structure with adaptive, flexible methods, standards, more discretion, even with legal certainty, and regard for context. And that's why I believe that feedback loops are extremely important. That's why accountability, again, monitoring is extremely important. Learning with the decisions that are taken, the laws that are enacted, exactly because things are not to happen just at one moment, but they are for the future too. So these adaptive legal systems will certainly have high tolerance for uncertainty to face environmental and climate issues. It must obviously live together with conventional legal frameworks because of certainty. It is not the solution, but it's certainly one additional and important instrument to improve how complex systems can function. These are only some examples of how a city could enact adaptive law and apply adaptive law, enacting legislation and decisions in a progressive way in different stages with more planning, trying to involve different actors, again, making people sit at the same table, improving community action, public participation, again, the human beings being part of decision and lawmaking, and then monitoring, using new technologies, sensors to improve law and regulation and its application, and even why not judicial adjudication to be based on current data, on well, the big question would be real time, and at the end, more soft law and more plurality of legal methods, models and mechanisms. Looking at how our cities can be more adaptive or maladaptive, here's a suggestion of two possible routes to regulate in cities to prevent pollution or to reduce pollution. It could be upstream with industries or economic actors, or downstream with consumers. And it is obviously easier at some moments to do it downstream, to look at consumers or to look at citizens and try to regulate the use of polluting products by individuals. And here again, technology could help making things better. Public participation is also a possibility, using the human sensors with smartphones and platforms, the My Neighborhood solution, for example. Sofia Ranchardaz, a colleague of ours, and Klopp suggest that data-driven regulation and governance in smart cities exposes the potential and challenges of using data science and predictive analytics in administrative decision-making and the delivery of public services. And also from an environmental and climate perspective, this is extremely relevant. I just leave you an example of what happened in Lisbon in the last years. Regulation in force here on the left, with different stages. One first stage in 2011, the other one in 2012, and the third one in 2015. So trying to reduce traffic in these places. The blue one for older cars, and the orange one for not so old cars, and different dates, cars dates, or the age of the cars has been changing changing from these from 2011 to 2012 and then 2015. So at the moment, it's impossible to get in this zone, the blue one, with cars older than 2000, and the orange with cars older than 96. This is what I believe is an adaptive solution. And then there's a proposal which I would say is more command and control, and that's why, in fact, it's not as easier to apply because these, as you can see, this square, the image is for cars not to enter unless they are owned by people who live in these places. And this is possibly, well, it's very likely to be repealed. That's what people are saying at the moment, exactly because it's not adaptive. So I leave you this this thought from Benjamin Cardozo, from a former Supreme Court of the United States Associate Justice. The inn that shelters us for tonight is not the journey's end. The law, like the traveler, must be ready for tomorrow. It must have a principle of growth, and that's why I believe we need smarter law and regulation for smarter cities. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Thiago. Thank you for that. We'll move on now. Beatrice, you've got the floor.
Perfect, thank you. So let me share my slides for a second. Can you see them? Perfect. So hi everyone, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having us. My name is Beatrice Potero. I'm a Colombian lawyer, but I'm currently based in France. I'm an assistant professor at Sciences Po, and I'm also affiliated to the Berkman Klein Center in the US. So my presentation today is about law and the political economy of smart cities. And basically what I'm going to do is going to map my field of intervention, and then what do I mean by the political economy of smart cities, and then give you some examples of what I'm talking about. So what am I intervening in? So today we've heard already interventions on smart cities that are by lawyers. So that doesn't necessarily speak to the type of people that I'm talking to, but and then maybe my co-panelists might feel identified by this. When we hear about smart cities, most often by people that are not lawyers, but also there's like two main narratives. So one of them is, and this is a bit of a cartoon, so there's always nuanced person in every space, but let's go with the cartoon so you can get what I'm talking about. So to your left, you see the poster of the Smart City Expo, which is one of the biggest gatherings by mostly the tech industry intervening in the smart city space. And I love their 2019 poster, which is what you're seeing, because it said it was cities made of dreams. And they're really trying to like sell us this digitized version of the city where everything is possible. Sustainability is possible, equality is possible, efficiency is possible. Like, we are gonna make you happy. And they also really pitch smart cities as the solution to a bunch of very complex societal problems in cities, from pollution to inequality to, and that's a little bit what they are doing. And to the right, we have sometimes people in the civil society sphere, or maybe in the information and society type of scholarly world, that are really cautious and really much against smart cities. So there's this NGO that I actually really like. I've collaborated with them, but they're like just cities, and they're like, you see like the stop thing, and it's like survey, like stop this, it's bad. And the image above is from the Hunger Games. I don't know if any of you have seen the Hunger Games, but it's like a sci-fi movie of a like very surveillance-driven world with a very big and powerful city in the center. And again, this is a cartoon. The people from Just Cities are actually great at what they do, but they're really worried and really raising concerns and complaints about how smart cities technology might actually entrench inequality, might entrench discrimination, might really innate surveillance. and they're like really pushing against that. My intervention is trying to show these two groups of cartoonesque people, so the nuanced people involved will not be surprised by my argument, that there's a lot happening in the middle. There are incentives leading cities to adopt these technologies. There are institutional dynamics and market dynamics that are leading people to adopt these technologies. And there are also incentives and institutions and path dependencies that will not realize the smart city dream entirely. So I'm trying to understand a little bit how everything fits together, and trying to intervene in this space to show you actually, and we are amongst lawyers, that there is a place for law in shaping smart city futures. So how does this look like? So this is my graph of how it looks like. So for those of you familiarized with like code and cyber law and stuff like that, this is a less clean version and pretty much inspired by Larry Lessig's traditional codes law. So he has like this thing that if you're listening to us and you don't know it, you can like Google it very quickly. It like will show up first thing where he talks the pathetic dog theory, and he says people are influenced by law, but their ideas, ideology, like what they think about the world, by norms. So it's not only law, but like religion, culture, and so on, but also code and technology. So what he's saying is, depending on how wide the bridge is in a city, you will be able to cross only with your bike or with a car or with a truck. And that changes behavior in the city, changes the type of thing that you can do crossing that bridge. And on the internet, that's pretty much enabled by the code and the architecture of website. And both things interact in smart cities. An easy example for those of you, for example, who are Instagram users, is that Instagram doesn't allow hyperlinks. So it's difficult to surf the web from Instagram, but it's very easy from Twitter, because I'm always like clicking on the things that people are sharing. That's a little bit harder to do on Instagram, and that shapes a little bit our interactions. So my graph here takes that, but this is actually drawing mostly from the work of Yochai Benkler, and I'm saying, and what the political economy view of technology says is that technology is developed in context. It's developed in context in two ways. The first time, let's assume a moment without technology, that's my T1. And technology is a function of institutions, the law, the market, and ideology. So we design our technologies based on the problems that we're facing, on the money that we have to invest in a particular development, and on the ideas that we have about what makes the world possible. And these things are influenced by power, by politics, and everything is like co-influential. So it's a function of those things. In a second moment, the previous technology influences what follows. So it's very hard to us, for example, to imagine, I don't know, a holographic phone, because we're very screened to our touchpad right now. We're very used. So we develop like cleaner touchpads and so on, but like we don't really skip that much, because our previous technology sort of also influences the second moment of technological development. So what I'm trying to say to people who are intervening in the smart city space is that in moment one, we need to pay attention to the context that is leading to a particular development of smart city tech, especially if it's a context that we're worried about, because there might be something in the context that we can change to change the incentives. In the second moment, though, it's important to also pay attention to the actual tool being developed, because that will influence the next stage of technological development. So, for example, I don't necessarily think that facial recognition is problematic per se. Like I use it on my smartphone, and I don't think that's particularly bad. But when we're deploying it on city streets, that might be that might be concerning in the long run. So we need to pay attention not only at the moment of development, but also at the moment of deployment. And how does that look like? That might have been a little bit abstract. So let's start with an example that has actually nothing to do with digital technology, and it's cities and cars. So before smart city tech, long before that, maybe a century ago, one of the biggest like technological transformations of cities was actually the appearance of cars en masse. So you have to the left an image of like a city, maybe sometime late in the 19th century, and then another city to the right, which like has completely accommodated cars. And one of the things that we often hear is, and especially if you live in a city that has been like excited about bikes lately, is that engineers came and they opened up like the way for cars and like changed everything, and they were like completely focused on making this technology fit in. And there's a lot of truth to that, but that's also not a very clear view. One of the things that is interesting if you go into this space is that cars were pretty much banned in cities when they first appeared. There are laws, archival laws that say that, for example, if someone wanted to take their car out, they had to like let people know with like a week in advance. Another fantastic rule is that you had to have someone walking in front of the car with a red flag, just like letting people know that you have like this monster that is noisy and whatever. I don't know. So cars weren't really welcome in streets at the beginning. Parking was largely outlawed. But then one of the key things that happened to actually turn cities into what you're seeing to the right is World War and things like the Marshall Plan or the Green New Deal. So all of a sudden you have like this imperative need, especially in the West, to develop the economy, and you needed to build infrastructure. And by building infrastructure was the way in which we're going to like rebuild our societies. And then you had, of course, this technology that required infrastructure. And you also had all these people coming back from war who had been promised like a life, and cities were cramped and there weren't, and so suburbs became all of a sudden attractive to like actually pay back that promise of sacrificing and maybe risking your life, but then afterwards having like a nice house in a nice neighborhood somehow. So there were laws in place incentivizing the construction of highways, there were economic incentives, and there were ideological incentives, and of course there was the lobby of the car industry intervening in that and selling the idea that cars could do that. But then all this system was mobilized to actually turn cities into that. This is, if you live in Europe, this is way more, I mean, this is actually a European city, but the suburbanization of cities is way more acutely visual in the US, but you also see that in places around London, for example, around Paris, you also have that suburban. But so that's a little bit the argument that I'm trying to make, that there's all these things that happen to transform cities with technology. And this is a recent example, and this is my last example. So if you are in the smart city space, there is, I'm not telling you anything new when I say that after 9/11 and the terrorist attacks in Europe that also followed, there was like this institutional shock that led to the vast adoption of surveillance technology. So that's already like a common understanding that institutional shocks lead to the adoption of technology in a particular way. But a less known story is, and if you are in the US, you might recognize this defund the police type of slogan, is that one of the things that has led to the particular adoption of policing technology in the US is that at the same time that the federal government in the United States, in this example, was really investing a lot of money in surveillance technology at all stages, police was already being defunded. And the way in which they were being defunded, especially after the financial crisis of 2008, was cutting down a bunch of the social services attached to policing. So police lost funding to have psychologists or to have social workers and so on. But at the same time, they could still apply to these federal grants that were being offered to adopt all sorts of surveillance tech. So you create a bunch of institutional incentives to have police adopt vastly surveillance technology, while at the same time changing the incentives for them to have like more holistic approaches to complex problems. And so one of the interesting things, if you go and talk to police officers of this era, is like, yeah, I know that like having a camera doesn't necessarily help me address this problem with drugs in that corner, but that's the money that I have. Because that's how public institutions work, like their money is pegged to things and to others. You can't really spend freely like you would do in a private corporation. So that's the type of institutional incentive, legal incentive that shapes smart city adoption. And I think going back to the first slide, if we want to ideally do have cities made of dreams with the help of technology, we should be paying attention to the institutional incentives that are leading to the adoption of tech one way or another, because that might be important. And that's it. Thank you.
I must admit, I have to hold myself back from wanting to ask questions right now, but I will bite my tongue. Pavi, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. I try to share the presentation. Can you see my presentation now? Okay, I am going to talk about how to govern and process personal data in a smart city. And it is a fact that sustainable solutions in smart cities need data, but the data very easily turns to personal data which means that at least in the Europe, the personal data protection regulation comes into force then, and we have to follow the rules of GDPR and national personal data protection laws. And also some crucial questions are who governs the data and how, and also how citizens could better decide when they give their data and for what purposes and with what conditions. And for example, transparency is here a very important factor, because only if the processing and sharing and collecting data is transparent, only then can a person give an informed consent to processing his or her data. And finally, I will discuss whether the GDPR is fit to deal with data processing in a smart city. And I have shared my slides in SlideShare. I can put a link to these slides later to the chat if someone is interested in reading those slides. Oh, well, how can I go forward with it? So data is a prerequisite for a sustainable smart city. And smart city technology is very much built on using the data, and it is a tool in promoting sustainability and providing services for inhabitants. And the purpose of smart city solutions is to foster economic growth and decrease costs while increasing sustainability, service production, participation, and quality of life. And the data can be used in government and administration, buildings, heating, lighting, traffic, and sensors measuring pollution, etc., etc. But because the concept of personal data is so wide, we can say that most of the data that is processed in a smart city applications and solutions is personal data. And the GDPR defines personal data as any information that can be linked either directly or indirectly to an identified or identifiable individual. And the fact that also data that individual makes the concept of data provide, because with technological tools that are available today, it is quite easy to craft the data and process the data so that it can be found out who the person behind the data really is. And also pseudonymized data is personal data. So even though we wouldn't directly know who the data concerns about, the question can be of personal data if the person is identifiable. But of course, data which only relates to companies or legal persons or which cannot be linked to any identifiable person is not personal data. That is anonymized data, and then the GDPR is not applicable to processing such data. And here are the short definitions of anonymization and pseudonymization, but due to limited amount of time, I will not discuss this more. One very crucial question in smart city context is that who governs the data and how. And that requires that the roles and responsibilities of data controllers and processors has to be defined, and there has to be a clear understanding of who is the controller or joint controller of data and who is the processor, because then we define who is responsible for ensuring that the requirements are followed and the data subjects' rights are ensured. And this has also practical implications. For example, the GDPR requires that joint controllers make a contract, and also that controller and processor make a contract where they define their responsibilities and duties. And these roles and responsibilities has also to be communicated to data subjects according to General Data Protection Regulation. And For example, in that project where I was involved, we tried to make a neutral host who would have been hosting the data and processing it and maybe selling it forward. And that would be a good idea how we could make use of data in a smart city context. But it is a little bit complicated when we also have to deal with the GDPR, because the data so easily is personal data, and then we have to follow all the requirements that are set in the GDPR. But I think it would be very important to find solutions how the data could be used for the benefit of all, and also how we could avoid monopolies or oligopolies so that the data wouldn't only be in the hands of very few actors, so that also new companies and new applications could come into market and use the data for the benefit of citizens. And from data subjects perspective, it's also important to know that who gets access to data, and that the personal and that the data subjects also has access to data concerning them. And every time we process personal data, there has to be a lawful ground for processing it. And the lawful grounds are listed in the GDPR. There are 6 different lawful grounds for processing data. And if we process data that belongs to special categories of data, also the special requirements has to be fulfilled. And also, of course, processing principles like purpose limitation principle, data minimization principle, and other principles has to be followed when data is processed in smart city context. One very important question is that how citizens could better decide when they give their data, for what purposes and with what conditions. In everyday life, we have to give consent for many kind of processing activities, and quite often we don't read the terms and conditions because it would be so time-consuming. One very important thing is the transparency, because it is for using other GDPR, and it also empowers data subjects to hold data controllers and processors accountable. So transparency is a very important factor when we are processing data in smart city context. Other relevant factors are, for example, consent and fair contract terms, so that consent means that a person has clearly indicated that he or she is willing to consent processing his or her data. And according to GDPR, the recital, silence, or pre-ticked boxes or inactivity shouldn't constitute a consent of processing data. And here I have just been thinking whether legitimate interest or a general interest could be grounds for processing data if the purpose for processing is to provide more sustainable ways of consuming resources in a smart city. But this is a question that needs more time to think about, and I just mentioned that these are very relevant factors. And also the data protection impact assessment must be done if much personal data is processed. And finally, I think it is very important to think whether the GDPR is fit to deal with data processing in a smart city, or is it in Europe more or even too difficult to build up smart city systems because the GDPR regulation is so strict compared to many legislations in other parts of the globe. Because due to the wide concept of personal data, the GDPR often applies to smart city solutions, and this requires very in-depth knowledge on the GDPR and its interpretation. And however, in terms of many smart city applications, there is not much code practice or practice by data protection authorities. So there are still solutions that we don't know if they fit with GDPR or not. And that is a factor that will be cleared out later when we get more code practice regarding this topic. And one crucial question is how to ensure that data protection requirements or uncertainty of interpreting data protection regulation do not prevent the introduction of useful inventions that benefit people and humankind. And thank you for attention. And I will share, or I already have shared these slides in SlideShare if you are interested. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I like conclusions to presentations that raise questions rather than answers. And I think that's very useful for today. Last but not least, Gregory, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, I share my presentation. Here it is. Well, today's topic, thank you firstly for the coordinator for inviting me. Thanks to Professor Evaline and Mark Finlay, and thanks to Constance Bozet, who's so nice. I'm very happy to be here with you all. Okay, smart city is often considered from a technical point of view with data, AI, and smart grids. Today's reflection is the following: how to conceive a smart city around the human and social link. My proposition will be to see smart cities through the concept of public services. The concept of public services dates back to the beginning of the 20th century, precisely when population growth led to a significant expansion of cities due to the rural exodus or rural flight, we can say too, in Western Europe. And there is an interesting historical comparison to do. 50% of the West population became urban between 1920 and 1930. And 50% of the world's population is urban since 2020. So we can say public services is a notion that allows the satisfaction of minimum social needs in dense populations. It was up to date in the 20s in the Western countries, especially in France, and it can be up to date in our 20s, but worldwide. Not only for army or police, but all kinds of public services. Public services is a concept that includes a regulatory role to public bodies. One of the biggest issues is the question of governance. These roles given to public bodies allows easier interconnection of networks and services. It allows services that are not financially profitable to, that are not cost effective. And it allows services to be accessible to all. And to all means for reasonable and comparable price too. The key word is providing public services. It is not a question of investments or a question of technology. It is a question of people. It's the people who have the benefits of these services. Smart city is a people-oriented view of this, our proposal to make a smart city through public services is a people-oriented view of the smart cities, not through the technology, but through the people. Which public services are we talking about? I mean, every public services and the economical one, we can say. It is, for example, water, and I'm speaking of drinkable water or not, used or not, electricity, renewable or not, waste, and we can talk about waste sorting or circular economy. It is traffic, and we still have spoken about it. It is public transport, which is linked evidently to traffic. It is school canteen, for example. It is culture, with media library, music academy, and so on, and it is security. And all these public services are for the people. But what are the management methods of public services? It is a question of legal tradition of each country, and it can be done directly from the municipality with its staff and resources, or it can be done by contracts supervised by the municipality, I mean public procurement contract or concession contracts. Both are often, and particularly in Europe, subject to public tendering procedures. In this case, it is the clauses of the contract that must guarantee the condition of the public services. A necessity, think first of the well-being of the people and then of the technology and the means that we include in the contracts. However, the smart city is a way to rethink these public services. For example, in transport, with autonomous and clean vehicle, maybe my car will not be my car, but our car, which will drive 4 or 5 people to work every morning at different times. That's a new public services like bikes or other not gas-fueled transport means have been made in different cities. It is energy that can be a new public services too, with the interconnection between sources of energy, renewable not, and energy storage in cars, in dams, in home batteries. And it is the optimization of use, monitoring and less energy for non-new things, lamps in the streets with nobody, for example. And maybe a third and new public service can be nature in the city. We can have farms which limit travel, therefore the carbon footprint of what we eat, biodiversity, direct compensation of the CO2 created by vegetalization, walls or farms and so on. And nature in the city is a way to regulate temperature and save energy too in the cities. The question is, who's in charge of the smart city? For the whole city, it must be the municipality itself. But, and we often see the implementation of municipal services for a smart city. It's a good way to have a global and integrated point of view on the public services, and to have one municipality which regulates everything about the public services in his municipality, in his city. And how to have a smart city policy. It can be made by a small district in a smart city. A district from scratch, because we can think it is an integrated way to make a smart city, and because it is a limited investment, or a renovation of the suburbs, it is densification, and it only can be done because there is no heritage to protect or respect in these suburbs. It's only little houses that are not so old. And in the districts, we have more opportunities, more solutions to choose. We can give the district to the GAFAs. We have the example of the Quayside at Toronto. For this large urban operation of $3.9 million, Google wanted to be the decision maker. It abandoned the project, saying that it was because of COVID, but some say it was because it didn't know what making a city was. He was only focused on technology and data, and not on public services, and not on the people in that city. It can be public authorities, yes, at the first place, but the question is, where can they find the money to invest? It can be done by contracts. This can be financed by creating the roads and services network, and by selling the land at higher price to real estate developers. We have these kinds of contracts in France. We use them a lot. In the end, having a smart city must be a political and democratic question for its shape and its public services. My conclusion, and I hope you like my ridiculous happy people photography. It's a kind of naive conclusion, I must admit it. Thinking of smart cities for public services means giving by choices to politics and not to profits. having a people-oriented point of view, having a good coordination of public policy, which is a way to optimize services, and having a better data protection or open data policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. I must admit, finishing off on an optimistic note is always useful for the moderator. But I'm sure I can get back to some gloomy stuff as well. What I want to do is to go through and pay the presenters the courtesy of one question each, and then we might just have a little interchange, and if time allows, we'll try and answer some of the questions that are coming through. I looked at one of the questions in the box. I might ask my team of presenters just to look at that one particular question, and I'll open that up to the floor when we have just quickly gone through the presentations one at a time. I'll also ask the presenters if they can to keep their answers as tight as possible. Iria, I was engaged with many things that you said today, particularly something that tied in with what Gregory just said, and that idea is that the smart city offers opportunities for change, but ... and those dots seem to indicate why those opportunities may not be realized. You talked about an absence of explanation. Do you think the automation of the frames of governance is really at the seat of the problem?
Loaded question, Mark. I think that depending on how we frame, we understand how sort of explanation of governance matters. If we're just focusing on, well, we now have more data, and the data is telling this story, and therefore I am motivating my governmental decision based on the data. Well, that's one approach. But I think that it's important to be conscious of the fact that the data, a little bit like technology, is an artifact, right? It bears our fingerprints. So if you have a huge universe of data, it will tell you almost the story that you want it to say, depending on the questions that you ask, right? So if you have information, for instance, about simply data about oceans, well, that tells you nothing. You will have answers about pollution when you start asking questions, how much of this particular chemical is now present vis-a-vis what was present 10 years ago, and so on and so forth. So it's a long-winded way to simply say that the abundance of data, it's being used in the explanatory side of accountability, but with less scrutiny about the fact that we can make often data say what we want it to say. And that, for me, leaves still that accountability gap. And very briefly, I'll plug something I'm sure the speakers will talk about, which is that a lot of the technologies that we're talking about are driven by AI. And AI lacks that there's a lot of work that is being done in the technical field to try to achieve explainable AI. Well, if a scientist today is not able to explain how a particular AI system got from point A to point B, what is the likelihood that a government official can? I'm going to stop there.
No, I agree with you in what you've said, and I reflect on telephone banking and chatbots to some extent, the way in which the machine has been used by the company, the organization, to diminish the possibility of accountability and explanation is at the heart of your concern. Tiago, you are talking about adaptive law, and you've done that in a way which seems to indicate that you believe that there are potentials for this new form of law to emerge. I won't interrogate where it's going to come from and who's going to be responsible and all that sort of stuff, because that's the rest of the night to explain. But I did wanted to ask you very simply that, do you think even if law is adaptive, there's a problem that non-lawyers just don't understand the language? So this sort of language disconnect between those who would advance the importance of law and, say, the tech community or the urban planning community or whatever. Do you think that there's some way that that language gap can be bridged?
Thanks for your question. Well, in fact, the idea of law to be more adaptive would exactly help that or try to solve that problem too, because having more or if law is more adaptive, we could bring other disciplines together in lawmaking and the application of law, and monitoring the application of law and regulation. So I would say that if we trying to make law more adaptive and regulation more adaptive, would also be trying to bring other disciplines and other people, even those who don't have any expertise. For example, young communities. I have a recent project with young communities with the University of Surrey in African countries, and we have been working with the governance of plastics, and exactly the possibility of giving young communities the opportunity to participate in certain decision-making decision-making processes, or giving local communities to be part of the process, would be something completely different. We already have some examples of it, but I believe that there's a lot of room to improve in that. Again, I would say that this is not the solution. This is a solution or an instrument that could help improving the application and then the enforcement of law and regulation.
Thanks for that. That segues nicely into a question that I wanted to raise with Beatrice. I like your duality between good, bad, dreamland, nightmare analogy of the city. But I was also fascinated by your touching on another area which obviously you have an interest in, and that is the sort of degrading of essential elements of city life that we would otherwise rely on, like security, order, safety, that sort of stuff. And much of the problem behind the defunding policing shift, I think, is not just a question about whether we're wasting money on public police, but whether we're in fact supporting violent behavior within the administration of cities. Do you think that there's something in that confusion of what we're actually angry about and worried about in terms of the way in which we're attacking city institutions that needs to be clarified?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, I by no means. So in my example, I'm not necessarily taking sides with the defunding the policing argument. I think what's interesting to think about both when we do policy in general, but also when we're thinking where we are plugging in technology to solve an issue, is to have some clarity about what the issue is. And then what happens often is that in the technology hype type of moment, and then these are also like companies and they're selling their products, like they don't do it, they don't mean badly, it's just what they do. There tends to be a vision of you can plug in tech to solve any problem. And I think what tech savvy city governments need to start doing is thinking, well, is this actually an issue where technology can help me, or isn't it? So we've mentioned a few of those instances in this conversation already. So if you want to optimize traffic, it's like, yeah, get good data, like that makes sense. Or if you want to optimize public utilities, like, but there's some issues that are more complex, in which I'm a little bit more skeptic of how plugging in technology, typically having more data on an issue, is interesting. So yes, you want to know what are the most vulnerable neighborhoods to I don't know, a certain type of crime or something. Yeah, get some data on where are people calling 911, but then you also need to be aware that it's likely that in those neighborhoods, people don't trust authorities and may not be calling 911. So it's not only about what the data tells you, but what the data is not really telling you. And I think those layers of analysis are important to keep in mind. You mentioned something else that I think is interesting, which is about like these things of city life that we might be or not eroding maybe, or targeting with technology, like how do we keep each other safe and so on. And there So I will first say why I agree with that statement, and then a little bit why I sometimes disagree. One of them is one of the things that surveillance tech apparently has done from policing is to keep more officers off the street. That has sometimes good advantages. So it's good for disciplining officers, for example, that you only have police around when you actually need it, but then you also distance them from the problems. So in a very ideal scenario, a policeman knows the kid that's doing something, and then the level of intervention is different if you know who the kid is, if you know their family, and so on, than whether you just come in because there's been like a warning. So there are costs and benefits of keeping policemen off the street. That's a benefit, is that you just may not be raising that risk for some people. The cost is that you're keeping them off the communities, and so they don't know them as well. And that type of knowledge and trust might be important. But there are other ways in which we've been optimizing cities forever. So since the 1950s, all city policy is already oriented around efficiency. And there are good reasons for that, because cities have scarce resources. But the tech talk about making a lot of city services efficient is just plugging into policies that been thinking about for a while. And I don't really think it's about the device making, I don't know, streets less walkable or so on, but actually a bunch of policy path dependencies that have been thinking about how do we make cities more suitable for companies, because that's how we create jobs, or how do we make cities, what is the another like very typical example, more suitable actually for cars is one, and so on. So I think thinking about the layers of where these things are coming from is useful. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, you did. And I think it also raises for me one of the interesting issues about the sort of technology creating new images of our risk and new images of our endangerment. You know, the idea of giving, for example, and this is happening in many cities, women apps on their smartphones to indicate where in a city there might be a risk area and how they should protect themselves. And yet it's never directed towards domestic violence in the kitchen or situations where women would find a much more mundane but a much more apparent form of endangerment. You know, I liked your analogy with cars too, because in this country here, cars are driven by rich people, and therefore cars are a big problem, but we accommodate the cars. We don't solve the problem, which is an interesting point. I wanted to go to you, Powie, and the idea of the separation between personal data and other forms of data, which the GDPR relies very heavily on. That works in, or it has better chances of working in parts of the world where you have a clear rights-based notion to the protection of data. But if you look at what was happening during COVID, particularly in Asia, there was mass data sharing of public and private. You know, the sort of discrimination of data sources just disappeared, creating now a sort of enormous pool of unidentified data and data sources. Do you see mass data sharing in big cities as a major challenge to the protection of personal integrity and personal data?
Yes, it is a little bit challenging, because sharing mass data might help in many cases. For example, help to predict where the diseases are spreading and where are most contagious diseases spreading, and help to prevent them. But as the technological tools are developing, it is becoming easier and easier to connect a certain data to a certain person. For example, if we have location data, we quite soon see a pattern that one person comes from one place, goes maybe to kindergarten, then maybe to work and back home. So, and regarding this location data, we can soon identify the person. So I hope that this regulation could be interpreted so that it wouldn't prevent good inventions, but of course the meaning of that is to protect our privacy and personal data, and balancing those rights is not always very easy. Of course, most of the balancing activities have been made when the regulation was made, but there's still some margin of appreciation when we interpret this regulation. But the concept of personal data is quite wide, and maybe we could more interpret the legal grounds of processing in such a way that it would make the good use of data possible. But sometimes, at the same time, it is difficult to bear in mind that the data which we can use to good purposes, in the worst scenario, it could also be used to bad purposes. So it is very easy to say that we should collect data, for example, in order to prevent COVID infections, but at the same time, we have to remember that there are always risks when personal data is collected, and that is why we have this regulation.
Yeah, and maybe there's a situation too, I think, where regulators need to be a little bit more aggressive, certainly in areas like the sharing of personal data by social media platforms when they choose to transfer personal data into what they call business data. And all of a sudden your post, which was to your friend, becomes something that they sell to the advertiser. And that creates, you know, a whole world of difficulties. We just finished an interesting piece of research on the way in which young people, particularly young women, are directly affected by the transit of personal data into advertising product, and how that can then impact on personal identification, personal images, and the pressures that puts on young people. Gregory, just to finish, I was thinking, I really do hope that your optimism is founded, that we can say that the provision of public services in smart cities is what smart cities should be smart for. But what I worry about a little bit, and perhaps you could give me your view on it, is the trend now to collapse all this provision of public services into super apps, which sometimes are run by the private sector. And so the state just stands back and says, oh, look, you know, we don't have a problem here. You know, Grab can deal with that, or whoever it might be. What happens if public service provision is reduced not to the benefit of the public, but rather to the efficiency and cost saving of administrators?
It depends on what you're calling public services. I mean, if public services is only made by public bodies, okay, there is a problem with the data and so on. But if you say public services is a service before all, for everybody, and then you choose the way you make it. You can make it by a contract, public procurement contract, concession contract, and so on. And the problem is then, what do you write in your contract? If you can regulate the data, regulate all the problems, regulate the fact that the public service is for people and not for making money. And in the contract, I mean, contract is a way to regulate an economic activity as a normal act from a public body. I mean, having a contract with a private firm for making a public service is not having a private with a firm when you're a private firm, and that's the difference. I mean, if you always think public bodies is equal to public services, and then there is no public service, you can't do what I presented to you. But if you think public service is an activity, so the way to regulate it can have many forms.
I agree, and I think one of the areas that lawyers perhaps are not very energetic in discussing is the impact of private law on the development of public cities, smart cities, and the way in which private law and contract relations could actually stand in the way of what some of us have talked about earlier, in particular about this idea that we should be able to make the administrators accountable to what it is that we're concerned about. Beatrice, you had your hand up. What point did you want to raise?
No, yeah, I just wanted to piggyback there and say that's one of the exact examples to your previous question, in which you need to pay attention to we need to pay attention to the underlying infrastructure when we are then hiring private companies to optimize services, which is what they ultimately do. And so the problem is not optimization, because whatever service you have at home, you want it to be efficient. So that's optimization is not the problem per se, but there's an underlying question of what is that we are optimizing. And
that's right. And
sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and coming in over the top of that, that goes back to Gregory's point about providing. Who is the provider? And if the provider actually is a contracted agent, then it's easy for them just to turn around and say, well, look, we don't have any reason to tell you what our terms are, because we're doing that with our client. And then law comes back to Tiago's point. It becomes a retarder of adaptability rather than a promoter of adaptability, which I think is important.
In France, we don't have so much this problem because we have public contracts. I mean, for you, contract is a private contract, and you don't think it can be regulated. It's freedom. But in other countries, some like France and Italy, I think, and we have public contracts. So it is contracts, real contracts, but the public bodies have an impact on it, and they can write everything they want to protect public services. And if the contract tender makes something that is not okay with the fact of protecting people, of making it whatever it wants with the data and so on, but the public body can break the contract. And this notion of public contracts, which seems not to be so how can I say liberal, is a better way than a pure private contract to make it. Or the public bodies can use pure private contracts, but they must be very aware of what they're writing in it, just to protect the public services, because it's their power to do it.
Yeah, I think that's interesting too. And if you look at it from some of the countries in Asia where the distinction between public and private is not clear anyway, and if you have autocratic states where basically the state can say, well, we will intervene here whether you call it private or not, and some jurisdictions like Korea where the laws in relation to personal and communal privacy are so powerful that they require an openness in private contracting, which is perhaps not necessarily in the mind of the common lawyer. I don't want to get tied down, but I'm just going to say to Eva, in case you have something you'd like to ask, I'll keep that on hold. Just, is there anyone in the team that would like to have a shot at that question that was put up in the Q&A, which is the top question about inequality? Have you had a thought about that? While you're having a think about it, I'll have a go at the second question. The trust in public as opposed to private services is surely misplaced without the governance, protection, and understanding that was flagged by IRIA. And I think Gregory has also identified the importance of certain styles of accountability. The point I'd make about trust is that cities can't exist without trust. And if we're in a situation where there is a profound distrust of governance, and this is happening, you talk to anyone under the age of 30 in most countries around the world, there is a profound distrust in conventional governance and a very significant distrust in municipal administration. That creates a range of different problems. Does anyone want to have a shot at that discrimination question? Well, I've got three in a line here. Iria, can you have a shot?
Just very briefly, I wanted to agree with the comments that are being made in that sort of the first question. When we're thinking about technology and data, we are overlooking realities that are present in some of the most developed countries. So we're creating what is known in the literature, and I think also across the board, as a digital divide, which I think creates deeper divisions between communities, makes the advancement of leveling up, as some people want to call it, much harder. And I think having positive awareness about what we are doing and which these communities are, because some are certainly the more deprived from an economic perspective, but we also have the elderly. They may not necessarily suffer from social deprivation, but they have a completely different interaction relationship with technology. So I think the point is very well made, and it's one that academics and policymakers should really keep for the forefront of their mind as they sort of push forward.
Absolutely, and it's been very, very clear, certainly in Singapore during the COVID crisis, that the different demographics and the different social locations, particularly with migrant workers and others, in terms of being able to access the benefits of what the smart city holds, has been an additional discriminator. I'll come back to the hands in a second, but Eva, do you have anything that you'd like to throw into the mix here?
Can I just say something in relation to the elderly? I find that a quite important point, and I think there's something, we should see this from two perspectives, because we think that the elderly are excluded from the use of technology, but I think they can benefit quite substantially from the use of technology. And I can see that in my own family, with my mother having to go through authorities personally without being able to walk because there's no means of technology available for her to do certain things. So I think we should take that into account as well, and see that technology can actually hugely benefit people that are not very mobile, if we give them sufficient support. So I find that a quite interesting discussion in itself, actually, and take that role of the elderly out and look at it from different perspectives and see the advantages and disadvantages.
Absolutely, and I mean, Gregory's just made a point about the diversity of legal traditions that we need to be aware of, different approaches that we have. Just on that point that you made, Eva, in Singapore, the government's been very keen to introduce sensors into public housing estates to protect the elderly. But I've been talking to a lot of elderly people who would say, well, no one ever asked me whether I wanted a sensor in my bathroom, but I might be perfectly happy to have a sensor in the elevator or the stairwell or something like this. So that idea of trying to pitch it to the recipient community becomes important. Tiago, you had a hand up.
Thank you. I guess that Beatrice was first. No.
Oh,
okay,
sorry. You first, because you haven't had a shot, and then we'll go.
Okay, thank you. Well, just to try to also build on some ideas that were answered when to Donovan. In fact, I would say that, well, totally right. But I would say that, as I started to say before, that making use of social media and apps or new apps that human beings can use, and that they can be accepted, understood as human sensors. In fact, there are some experiences, and that experience I recently had with some African local communities, and also in Jamaica, specifically with schools and young people. They really have this opportunity to have access to information. So, and the results of some questionnaires demonstrated that they have access to social media, they have access to apps, and they can share the views with others in the whole world. So the problem here is the connection between the people and the government, which also has to do with that idea that Gregory said about the public services. I would say that it's really important to try to enhance this connection between the communities, and that's why national governments and local governments, specifically in cities, have now the opportunity to make use of these electronic apps, even social media, to try to improve this relationship. Let me just also say that, and also build on what Gregory said. Public procurement and public procurement rules are extremely important in everything that we have discussed here. If there is no public will, it's very difficult to implement all these tools and all these instruments. But obviously, if we give opportunity to the people and to the local communities to also be part of this, it's a big step to go ahead. Thank you very much.
And I think two of the issues, and one of them comes back to a point that Piavi made earlier in her presentation about consent. You can't encourage public participation in any aspect of smart city development unless the public knows what's happening to their data. And it's one of the reasons why the Chinese recently introduced legislation about data reuse and the identification to third parties about that process. And I think also there's often a criticism, the public won't get involved because they don't care, or they're not interested, or they're disempowered, or blah, blah, blah. I can tell you for one that they will get involved if they understand that there is a mutual interest that can be served by their involvement, and that's very important. Beatrice, you had a point you wanted to raise.
No, it's okay.
Okay. I would love to go around the table and say, let's all have another shot at what was on the end of our tongue, but I won't because the time has run out. I just want to say this, it was a terrific panel, and I like the diversity of everything that we talked about, the different angles we came to. I hope at the very least this establishes a little community amongst the presenters to talk about their issues with each other. Anyone in the audience, if you want to talk to the presenters more directly, I'm sure they have no problems in talking with you. If you want to get access to their slides, I'm not sure, I haven't cleared this with them, but I'm sure that they would be happy to pass their slides through to BIICL unless there's a particular reason they are concerned in relation to their interests in the slides, but we will talk about that after the session. I'll hand back to Eva to conclude, but just to say it was a pleasure moderating the session. Thank you very much to the presenters for coming on board at different times in different parts of the world and sharing your ideas with us.
No, thank you from my side, obviously, as well. It was a great discussion that we had, and I would love to continue as well. So maybe we have a second round at some point with a specific focus on a specific topic. So thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks to our audience, but also thanks to Constance, who has very expertly organized this, and she's now, at least we can see her again. So thanks for being so involved in the seminar series, because Constance is actually the colleague who's behind all this, and I think we have to really give her credit. And thanks to our events team as well, to Liam and the staff at BIICL for the organization of this webinar. Thanks to everybody.
Thank you to everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you and have a nice day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Nice day, everyone. Thank you.